Turn it over to you, Adam. Welcome.
All right, fantastic. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here, and I really appreciate all of you joining us on this session this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are, or this evening, depending on where you are. As Hannah mentioned, I'm Adam Levine, and a professor at Johns Hopkins, and I also run this nonprofit called Research for Impact. It is really great to see you. And this is a workshop that I often lead that is sort of related to the book that Hannah mentioned, called Collaborate Now. And it really is about sort of how to sort of form new collaborative relationships and why they often don't sort of form on their own and kind of what we can do about it. And I'm going to start by sort of telling a story. And I do have slides, and I'm going to share my screen shortly. But I'm going to start by telling a story, just to kind of like illustrate sort of how I even got into some of this work and why I think it's sort of interesting and useful. And then there's going to be a slight interactive portion basically in the middle. I'm going to actually ask all of you some questions to think about and then invite hopefully some folks to respond. Hannah has already warned me that like it's a little bit hard, you know, with this size of a group and like via Zoom to sort of do this kind of in real time, but we'll do our best and you know, see how that goes. And then I'm going to kind of come back to sort of doing more kind of standard presentation style stuff. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So anyways, that's kind of so it's like a little bit of me, then you, then more of me, and then you. And so hopefully, you know, we'll break it up, and we have until 3:30 Eastern time. And I really do encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to be sharing my screen. And so unfortunately, I actually won't see the questions. But I know that like Hannah is on it. And so I really sort of, you know, encourage folks to share questions. And at the very least, we'll talk about them at the end. If not, you know, we'll, you know, she'll just sort of stop me in the middle. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and talk about some cool stuff here. All right. So that's me. And I want to start by sort of sharing a story. And so this is a story of Research for Impact 1.0. And there is a 2.0. In fact, the 2.0 is the part that exists right now. But Research for Impact 1.0 was formed back in 2017. It was me, and I have two amazing co-founders, and we're all sort of trained political scientists. And the reason why Research for Impact was formed was that all of us individually had a lot of people who were sort of coming to us and saying, you know, like and researchers who were coming to us and practitioners who were coming to us and saying, you know, we would love to engage in more sort of collaborative relationships cross-sectorally. But like, you know, like we don't really know how to get started. And, you know, people would sort of see me, like, for example, give, like, I was working with a number of different kind of nonprofit organizations, and, you know, they would see me sort of giving talks and at conferences and things like that. And I would often like get this question of sort of like, you know, where do you find these organizations? Like, how do you get them to talk to you and whatnot? And like, and I would get similar kinds of questions with policymakers, like, how do you get policymakers to sort of talk to you and you know, and whatnot, and vice versa. And so, so what we did is we started Research for Impact 1.0. which was an online platform. And it was a LinkedIn-style online platform in which researchers and practitioners and policymakers, though admittedly at the beginning, it was mostly researchers and nonprofit practitioners, could build profiles. And then the idea, just like with like LinkedIn or many online platforms, is that they could then reach out to each other and they could initiate new collaborative relationships. So this is what the homepage looked like. If you were to go to our homepage today, it looks a little bit different, but this is what it looked like back then. And, you know, so what would happen is people would build these profiles, and, you know, the profiles include a lot of different information. And so it would include, you know, things like, you know, sort of some basic demographic information, but then also a lot of questions about like your work. What kinds of, what are your kind of goals right now? What sorts of collaboration have you done in the past? What are you looking for in the future? What areas do you work in, both geographic, but also substantive, you know, and things like that. So within the first 10 months in 2017, 388 people, and I got 388 smiley faces, had built profiles. And what that means is that they like, you know, overcame like a wide variety of barriers in the sense that like, you know, clearly they were interested, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. Clearly, they, had some excess capacity, time, so on and so forth. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. Obviously, they had taken advantage of an opportunity because they had built these profiles. And so in a lot of ways, and what these profiles contained, and it's hard to sort of summarize them neatly, but it was a wide variety of people who were interested in the social determinants of health broadly, which my hunch is very much the case of a lot of folks in the room right now. These were people who were sort of either studying, like doing research on and or leading programs on and or designing policies to combat poverty, to improve nutrition, to improve transportation options, to increase voting, to build political constituencies, you name it. It really like wide variety of sort of like social determinants of health broadly defined kinds of challenges. And that was true, again, on like really both sides, both the researchers and the practitioners. And they'd overcome all these barriers. And in a lot of ways, based on sort of like essentially vanity metrics, we were doing really, really well, right? Because we had like 380 people who built these profiles within the first 10 months, which, was amazing. There was only one problem. Even though 388 people had built profiles from the research community, from the practitioner community, we had a handful of policymakers on there as well. Only 7 people had actually reached out to anybody else. And so what we had was essentially 388, well-crafted profiles with pictures and the whole 9 yards sitting on this site, but yet basically, nobody was using it for its intended purpose. From the perspective of our theory of change, things were not going well. So that was disappointing. I mean, honestly, I just have to, I have to just sort of tell you that, by the time we got to the end of 2017, it was very dispiriting because we had spent a lot of time, kind of to just sort of set up the website. I mean, to come up with the website, to set it up, to advertise it, to get people to build profiles, answer questions, all this whole 9 yards. But yet it clearly wasn't working. And moreover, by the end of 2017, we were at the point where, I mean, you all can probably completely relate to this, that information online about sort of what kinds of projects you want to do, what your goals are, things like that, had shifted because people had different priorities by that point. And so we sort of faced this kind of do or die moment at the end of 2017 where we sort of said, look, should we try to get people to update stuff? Or is this just sort of not working? And so, what I started to do, after I kind of was got over the initial, kind of sense, once I sort of admitted to myself, and we admitted to ourselves that this wasn't working, the question was all right, let me sort of put on my research hat for a second. Because it wasn't working, but it was kind of surprising that it wasn't working. And the reason why it was surprising was because the people who had built these profiles, they had overcome, as I said earlier, all of these barriers that would seem to be really important. That, clearly they had desire and interest, otherwise they wouldn't have done it, built the profile, right? Clearly they had some capacity, otherwise they wouldn't have built the profile. Clearly they had taken advantage of an opportunity. And all of those are some of the major barriers to collaboration. I mean, sometimes I think people use the term people refer to say organizational incentives. And I'm sort of lumping that under sort of desire and interest, right? Clearly, they thought, you know what, this is something that I could do, maybe I should do, whatever it is, right? But yet, nobody was reaching out to anybody else. The other thing that was sort of interesting is that or rather, so once I sort of realized that this was sort of surprising, I actually started reaching out to people and I would ask them questions, basically on the lines of oh, I'm just really curious, you built these profile, but you haven't really used the site, is there anything wrong with it, right? Did we kind of screw up in some way, when we designed it? And, what was fascinating with these responses is that the kinds of things that you might have expected to have people say, well, I don't really know how to collaborate, or something like that. That's not what people said. People sort of got a sense of they sort of know sort of broadly speaking, kind of how to do it. There's guides out there for kind of how to do it. that wasn't really the issue. Some people said like, well, I'm not really certain, kind of like sort of, like whether like now is a good time or not. And so there was a little bit of that, but like not that much. But really, by and large, what people sort of expressed to me was sort of like all of these barriers associated with essentially reaching out to strangers. Because that was really the key. What the Research for Impact online platform required for its success was that strangers felt comfortable reaching out to each other for new collaborative relationships. And what I was observing, and I'm going to unpack this a little bit more in a little bit, was essentially that like they don't feel comfortable doing that, even though they have joined a network, and even though they know other people have joined a network that is specifically for this goal. Okay, so that's sort of like the end of my story. What I want to do is I want to sort of segue now into sort of thinking about you and your goals, and in particular your goals for collaborative relationships. So with that in mind, I want to do, first of all, I want to share this, and then I want to ask you some questions. So my starting premise, and I want you to know that like I have gotten the like green light from Hannah on this, and so my hope is that like folks look at this and say, yes, that sounds like me, as opposed to why am I here? So you run programs or design policies that seek to improve communities you care about, and you believe that new collaborative relationships are important for making further progress. And so my starting premise for like why we are here this afternoon is that basically like this applies to you. And I guess I'll put it like a little bit differently, which is to say that like, for the policies and programs that you work on, it might be amazing if you had a bigger budget. It might be amazing if you had like more staff. Like that like could totally be amazing. That could even be transformative, right? But either like you don't have that or you won't have that in the near future, and or even if you had that, it is still the case that like, new collaborative relationships would be important for making progress on the kinds of challenges that you're facing. And so that's my sort of starting premise. And my hope is that for everybody in the room, you look at that and you say like, yeah, all right, I can get behind that. If not, we'll look at the participant count drop for the next like 30 seconds. So that's the first thing. So what I want to do now is I want to sort of give you a chance to sort of think about like your collaboration goals. And in order to sort of motivate that, I'm going to put 5 questions on the screen. And this is one of those moments where, especially online, it's a little bit hard to kind of do this. If we were in person, there's ways to sort of get folks sort of interacting with each other in the room and things like that. And it's a little bit hard to do that in kind of in an online space. But I want to sort of just like raise these questions and then give you some time to answer them yourself. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of ask folks to share a little bit with the room, anybody who feels comfortable, and we'll do that for a bit. And then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit more about sort of like why I'm asking these questions. Where do they come from? Why do I think they're important? And so on and so forth. So, oops. All right. So the first question, how does the success, and I'm just going to like read them all and then put them on the screen. How does the success of your program or policy relate to what is happening elsewhere? Are there decision makers or community stakeholders, and I mean that very broadly, who have information that would help improve the effectiveness of your work? And this might be people from other agencies within government. This could be community members. This could be leaders of advocacy organizations. It could be researchers. It could be other data experts, anybody like that. So again, let me just go through all the questions. That's question number 1. Question number 2. Would you be looking for informal collaboration? By that, I mean knowledge exchange. And or would you be looking for formal collaboration, which we can define as new projects over which you share ownership, decision-making authority, and accountability? And I want to also be clear that I think for some folks in the room, it might be that like you yourself might be looking for that. It is also the case that I think there's organizational leaders in the room for whom like you might basically have people within your organization who like, that they might want that. So I'm sort of, I want to allow for both. Then the third question is, what hesitations do you have about interacting with them? And what hesitations do you think they might have about interacting with you? And this could be capacity, it could be interest, it could be stereotypes, it could be lack of permission, Any other relational concerns? Question 4, why should they want to engage in a collaborative relationship with you? And then question 5 is, why do you think these connections don't exist already? So what I want you to do is take like just a few minutes, and I'm going to leave these questions up. I'll keep sharing my screen. Just take like literally like, 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. I'll go until 2:20 my time, just to answer them. And then what I'll do afterwards is I will unshare my screen so we can see each other. And I'm going to ask folks just to share answers to one or more of them. Okay, so just take like, again, just like a couple minutes, jot down answers to one or more of them, and then we'll come back just in 2 minutes. Maybe just another 30 seconds, and then I will stop sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna let's see if I can put the gallery on. I know that a lot of folks are not sharing their camera, which is totally fine. But now anybody
I will just invite you all that if you are in a position where you could just turn on your camera for a few minutes, that please do. It's also very nice for us to see your faces.
So is there any, so I just want to spend a couple of minutes and ask anybody who is so motivated, maybe you just like raise your hand and just share an answer, what your answers are to one or more. It doesn't have to be all of them, just whichever one, particularly first spoke to you. Who wants to go first? All of us always admire the person who goes first.
So true. And if any, you can either just jump in or raise your hand. Bold. Lena, are you? Yay! Yes. Thank you, Lena.
I was thinking about several of your questions in the sense that I do agree. And the reason why I'm here, as you said, is because I believe in the power of collaboration. And in my personal case, I recently graduated, and I graduated with my master's thesis talking about how to improve the visa situation for immigrants here in Italy in order to lower the impact that it has on us immigrants and our mental health. And of course, it was just a theoretical proposal, but since I graduated, I'm in a transitional period, to call it somehow. I have been exploring several collaborations here in Italy, governmental universities, some colleagues to try and develop my theoretical proposal and just figure out if the framework that I use is or not effective. And I have found myself with some good sides and some bad sides on the collaboration. So I'm going to be addressing your third question to be more particular. And it's what's the hesitations do you have about interacting with other people and the hesitations that other people have interacted with me? In my personal case, I am, even though I'm trying to overcome this, a very shy person, and I am very self-critical with myself. So I tend to expect people not believing in me since I just graduated. I don't have that much experience. And I am, as I just said, in a transitional period of my life. Nonetheless, I have found out very interesting responses, and a lot of people open to chat and interact and put some input to my research, which has been amazing and very satisfying to see. I haven't gotten yet to the point to be actually able to start the research, so I'm still working on that, but just the fact that people are responding and open to collaboration has been something that I honestly wasn't expecting. It was a really great thing.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna not respond to individual ones just to give people more time to talk, but we're gonna come back to this point for sure. Erwin.
Hi. In the government agency that I worked in, everybody was really busy because we had a lot of things going on, especially during the change of hybrid and all those kinds of activities. And so reaching out to others became very challenging when you have no time and you don't have additional hands to help do the coordination with the others you're not directly connected with, basically. So more work was essentially for 3, 4, and 5. It's like we just didn't have the capacity.
Okay, great. Thank you. Who's next? Maybe just a couple more, and then we'll go back to some of the slides. Anybody else? I know there's at least like one other person who's like, there we go, Maria.
And in the government agency I'm working for is the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Like, for my project, I do a lot on the data sets, like also calculating the regression models. Like since like the agency, it's very big. And normally like I work on my project and share with my supervisor, like about the progress, and occasionally like I meet with my supervisor to discuss about like what I have been doing, what I have done, and if it looks good or anything like that. And we have some like collaboration together, like me and another student, also another intern. It's in the division of data, the same department that I am in, and work under the same supervisor, which is, but like we work on the project. Both of our projects are on data analysis, but it's like kind of different projects. And I think like it's like we have been interacting like very good, and the project has been interesting. I really enjoyed the times like we interact together and how like we engage in what we are doing. And
Great.
the collaboration is like very helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. I also want to sort of it looks like there's like a couple of comments in the chat. And the fear of losing control, I think is definitely something that I want to come back to in a bit, because that is very much something that I sort of have seen in a lot of the examples that I've looked into as well. Let me for now, I'm going to go back. Oh, Jenny, do one more. Yeah.
Sorry, I can make it quick.
No.
So I work in Colorado and promote the employment of people with disabilities. And there's a collaboration between multiple state agencies, and we've got folks at the table that are provider agencies and advocates and all of that. And there's a lot of willingness to be there. But I really love your second question, because I think it gets to the heart of where we're at right now of, are we looking for informal collaboration, or are we looking at a space where there's ownership and accountability? Because I think we're kind of getting stuck there, because everybody's willing to be a partner, but no one wants to tell anybody else what to do or wants to assume that other people have capacity. And especially considering that there's turnover in positions, and when you have a government agency might commit to one person might commit to something, but then if their position changes or if they move on, then is there still that level of commitment from that organizational level, or was it more of a personal commitment? So I really appreciate these questions, because I think that taking it back as a group to help us wrangle what we're thinking of will help us be able to move forward in what we're wanting out of it. So thank you.
I want to really thank you for sharing. And, you know, it's one of the things that is going to basically be a through line between the next hour that we have together is sort of making things explicit that are often implicit or are not asked or things like that. And I think that, like, you know, one of the things about these questions, and maybe actually let me go back to sharing my screen, is that, you know, none of them are sort of rocket science in any way. But what they are is simply there we go. All right. But what they are is sort of a way to kind of make things explicit, that at least kind of one thing I've kind of learned over time does not necessarily happen automatically. And so I want to sort of like, let me talk for a bit more. And I think I'm going to talk for a bit. I will then actually probably like pause for questions. Maybe I'll even stop sharing the screen just to kind of see if anybody has questions, and I can keep going for a bit. And so why did I ask these questions? Right. So like, so far I've talked about the research for impact online platform experience and how that didn't work. And then I asked you these questions. So one of the things that like really sort of hit me by the online platform experience, the research for impact 1.0 experience, was that essentially what I was observing was that how there could be this thing called unmet desire to collaborate, which is that new collaborative relationships that people would value don't necessarily arise on their own. And the other thing I was observing is that that was the case basically like regardless of sort of multiple goals for those collaborative relationships. And so this was sort of the idea that like, you know, you might want to sort of have an interactive back and forth relationship with somebody where the goal is simply like knowledge exchange, so informal collaboration. But it could also be that your ultimate goal is to engage in a project with shared ownership, decision-making authority, and accountability. Or it could really be sort of something kind of in between, where essentially you want to maybe coordinate your decisions, but you don't like officially sort of have shared decision-making authority. I think that was certainly true like among like, say, public health agencies, many public health agencies during the pandemic. And so, but collaborative relationships can have multiple goals. And, you know, on the one hand, this is like, I think sort of like obvious to put this on the screen and point it out. But one thing I've often found is that like the word collaboration it means different things to different people. And it really often sort of connotes this idea of the more formal type. But the thing is that informal, the knowledge exchange is like sometimes all that people need and or want. And moreover, you know, you can have sort of something that starts informal and maybe becomes formal, or vice versa, you know, over time. And just to kind of be like even a little bit more specific, I mean, the Research for Impact online platform, when people built these profiles, a lot of people said, you know, like, for example, we had a lot of practitioners who said, you know, I would love to just sort of talk about like, what is the research on, you know, voter engagement, like say, you know, or what is the research on like, you know, how best to communicate about climate change? What does it say? Give me an overview, you know, something like that. And, you know, that is very much kind of like in thinking about the kind of informal type. And so I think it's really important to sort of distinguish between both of them and name and legitimize both of them. The other thing, which I mentioned before a bit, is that new collaborators often begin as strangers. And strangers can be uncertain and or hesitant about their ability to interact with each other. And that certainly came out in a couple of the comments that folks made from earlier, especially Lena's comment and stuff, but more generally as well. So, so there's this thing called unmet desire. And so we might sort of ask this question of kind of like, all right, well, why might desire remain unmet? And so a number of folks have mentioned a number of things, and I want to sort of put a full list here for completeness in a way. One is, lack of time. That was Erwin's comment for sure, right? Like, absolutely, right? And so lack of opportunity, no one asked, things like that. Never thought of it, no one asked. Lack of organizational incentives and or sort of, particularly for folks within a bureaucracy, say lack of like, explicit permission. Absolutely. But so there are these other things that, that research for impact online platform creators, profile builders, had expressed to me that, was really sort of like kind of, again, sort of making explicit things that often like really go implicit, which is basically like this uncertainty about how to relate to others, right? That really could take on lots of different forms. In some cases, it was about like, I'm uncertain how to engage with someone new. In some cases, it was uncertainty about how others will engage with you. It was also uncertainty about what others' collaboration goals were. And in particular, people were very uncertain about, is it okay essentially to just be looking for informal collaboration? Like there's this sense that like, if all I really want is knowledge exchange, like, can I really just have like, a pen pal or something like that, or something like that, and people were really kind of uncertain about that. But there were, behind these things, this is how I'm summarizing it, but just to even like kind of put a little bit more meat on the bones, people would say to me things like, I don't feel like I know what's appropriate or inappropriate to say. It's like script concerns. I'm not really sure how to start the conversation, right? Things like, I don't know if the other person is really going to value my knowledge or expertise. Things like, I don't know if the other person is actually going to be interested in talking to me. Things like, I don't know whether I can trust the other person. Things like, I don't really know, whether the other person really has sort of like knowledge that would be practical for me, or domain specific for me. And I think it's actually really interesting the way that people would separate those out. Like you can be like, a huge domain expert in a particular way, but still not necessarily be able to make that knowledge practical, or things like that. Now, status-based stereotypes absolutely heighten the uncertainty. And when I use the term status-based stereotypes, I mean sort of situations where people's people's knowledge or expertise around a topic is sort of tied to some stereotype that folks have about them. And so this like often sort of takes the form of sort of, that certain kinds of people are seen as being experts on certain kinds of things. And conversely, people sort of, might worry about their expertise not being recognized or valued in certain spaces. And so just to like put an example on that, that sounds kind of vague. Just to put an example on it, like people have written about, for example, the Flint water crisis. Remember, I'm a public health professor, so I'm using these public health examples. People have written about the Flint water crisis. Like have talked about sort of like lots of examples in which like the families who were experiencing like, the brown water and the lost hair and like other kinds of things. And this was often really, I'm saying families, but really it was often like mothers would sort of not necessarily have their expertise recognized when they went to public meetings, right? And, I think that's an example of sort of status-based stereotypes basically getting in the way of, people relating to others in the ways that they would like. The other thing that can heighten that uncertainty is political divides. And when I say political divides, that can also mean, I think, a number of different things. What I'm really especially thinking about is sort of that, when we are in a more polarized environment, people can often be motivated by, can often experience more of a group-based motivation than an accuracy-based motivation. And so what that means is that when they meet new people or when they think about interacting with new people, they process what those people have to say more in terms of whether they're on my side, whether they're perceived to be part of my group, and not so much in terms of whether the information that they are sharing is accurate in some way. And so it's kind of, you talk about sort of group-based motivation as opposed to accuracy-based motivation. And that can really sort of get in the way of recognizing other people's expertise. And I want to just sort of say, like, that kind of just to sort of sum up, this is the last thing I want to say on this slide, that like, when we talk about sort of collaborative relationships, like the whole idea of them is that people with diverse forms of expertise are engaging in back and forth in order to sort of try to improve a community that they care about, to better understand problems, think about how to solve them, evaluate things you've done in the past, so on and so forth. And so we're very interested in how can we ensure that people with this diverse form of expertise, and I'm using the word expertise here very broadly, can actually sort of like choose to interact with each other and then do so fruitfully. Okay, so that's all of sort of the kind of like theoretical. We did the questions. This is all kind of like theoretical stuff. I want to actually present some findings and some data that kind of are interesting and help to sort of like show the power of some of this stuff. In particular, sort of how to like why this relationality stuff matters and how to actually overcome this uncertainty. But let me just sort of like stop sharing my screen for one more second and just ask if anybody has any questions at this point. The answer might be no, but I just figure it's an opportunity just to kind of like also break up me talking. So anyways, anybody have any questions? And really, it can be anything at all. You can ask me where I got my shirt. And ask me where I got my glasses. That's totally fine. Or you can tell me that you are like dying to hear more. Thank you, Tina. I really appreciate the little laughing face. Okay. So yeah, if anybody has any questions or anything like that, and then we'll go back to I'll show you some cool data. It's really cool, by the way.
I don't know if this is a question.
Oh, wait, somebody just like spoke, but
sorry, no, Mark can go first. He raised his hand.
Oh, okay. I actually can't even see who's talking. Well, anyway, Mark, over to you.
Yeah. I'm loving this so far. Really, really helpful to hear. So I am part of an organization that's building out a professional association community. So trying to connect people that all work in the government space and public sector space. And one of the things that we've definitely heard, and you sort of mentioned this before, is the fear of the first sort of outreach, right? Being the first person to sort of start the conversation with people that they don't know. And the piece that you mentioned about the status element, I'm curious, like, does that end up being a factor in people raising their voice or starting a conversation in spaces where they just don't know people, and they might sort of like put in their own minds like this status element as well? Or how does that play into, when you have like a large group that's not anonymous, but fairly unknown to each other?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And it's a great question. And I think that, what's interesting about status-based stereotypes is that sometimes they can lead people to not talk. And it can be for any number of reasons, like what I mentioned. But I mean, especially things like, I don't think that my, expertise will be valued. I don't think people care about talking to me. I don't think people will be interested. People might act like I'm annoying them. It could be it can manifest in a few different ways. And so it can stop people from talking. I think alternatively, it can actually encourage people to talk who maybe, actually know less about the topic than they might think they do. Or that other people might sort of pay more attention to them than maybe is warranted. Or at least relatively speaking. And so like overall, it skews things. Now, it's the question of sort of how to like overcome that and how can people, I guess I'll say a couple things. One is that like, it's really hard to overcome stereotypes. Like I actually I have a number of friends who do research, specifically kind of on stereotypes, and, they say it's really, really hard. What is easier in a way is to sort of like, and what often happens is that if you gain enough knowledge about somebody, you sort of like carve them up as an exception to like, to a stereotype. But it may or may not necessarily like change the underlying stereotype. But one of the kind of, ways in which, people can sort of overcome stereotypes is to try to individuate as much as possible, to sort of gain as much like knowledge, like focus on the individual as possible. And there's a few different ways to sort of that you can do that to other people, but also sort of try to demonstrate that you want to that you welcome that information from others. And in fact, actually one of some of the data I'm going to present actually right after this Q&A part is going to speak directly to that. So what I would say is like there's a little bit of like of a response, but some of the data that's coming up will also speak to it. But then also what's also interesting about kind of relationality and stereotypes in general is that they are very sort of like context specific. And so one of the kind of challenges in a way is always sort of getting a sense of like, what might people be uncertain about, or what kinds of specific stereotypes might they hold in a particular context. And so that like is kind of speaks to the sort of translation of the kind of theoretical ideas to particular context. But again, I'm going to show an example of that in a second. There's somebody else who started speaking, but I don't see another hand.
That was me,
Oh,
Caitlin.
yes.
I just was gonna comment that I really appreciated the example you used of someone from the public speaking and not necessarily being seen as someone with expertise or experience. In my role with the town of Chapel Hill, I focus on community engagement, but specifically with equity in mind, which means that I focus on resident or immigrant and refugee residents. I think, as you said, we kind of also like self maybe like identify ourselves as experts or not. And I think that like that lived experience historically has not been seen as expertise, but it's something that our municipality is working on incorporating as something that's valuable. So I think I'm interested in hearing in like other ways that people are doing that, because it is particularly sensitive to work with people that come from historically disenfranchised backgrounds to build that trust. Because even if we can talking about unmet desires, they've had a history of that, right? And so like I'm curious about learning more about that, I guess.
Yeah, no, thank you for those questions. And let me I'm going to respond into two pieces. One is I really want to underscore how much I agree with the point about kind of thinking about expertise broadly, and especially defining lived experience as a form of expertise. And that is something that I personally go to great lengths to do. And in fact, actually, you're going to see that in the next study I'm going to present, like sort of the way in which I try to operationalize that in that one particular context. And so I really want to sort of like kind of like emphasize how much I agree with that point. On the other point, actually, about sort of like working with like communities. So I won't, I have like a lot of different examples, and sort of depending on usually who I'm talking to about this kind of stuff, I sort of pull out some and not others. And because I knew that this was a room of policymakers, I didn't plan to sort of talk quite as much about sort of forming, say, like kind of like community-based participatory research kinds of examples between researchers and community groups. But I am happy to talk about that during Q&A or to kind of talk afterwards to you as well as really to anybody else, because a lot of the matchmaking work that Research for Impact does is between, I should say, well, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, but so Research for Impact now is very different from the online platforms. We do hands-on matchmaking now, and I'll mention that a little bit at the end. But so through that hands-on matchmaking, which has been way more successful than the online platform, a lot of the kinds of matches will often sort of focus on sort of bringing together, like say, environmental researchers and say environmental justice organizations, and other groups that are trying to like working on issues related to immigration, trying to get increased voter turnout, like you name it, and so. I'm happy to talk about more examples of that, either during Q&A or afterwards. Well, so let me keep going for a bit on the slides. And again, so like just to give you a heads up, I mean, I'm thinking like we have 45 minutes left. I'm gonna basically talk for like another like 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll definitely have more time for Q&A at the end. So that's what's coming. So let me go back to sharing my screen, and get this off of there. So the two main takeaways, I mean, just at like the super high level, is simply, first of all, there can be this unmet desire. And I mention that simply to say that like my attitude, whether good, bad, or otherwise, is basically I look out in the world and I see a lot of like possibility that is often just not like being realized for a variety of reasons, not necessarily for bad reasons, but like so I think like, I want to encourage you, and I, people will push back on this and that's totally fine. But like, I definitely want to sort of encourage you to think that like, there can be this unmet desire to collaborate out there, and either that we might have it in ourselves and or other people who, have expertise that's relevant to the policies and programs that we are working on have as well. And then uncertainty about relationality is one key and often overlooked reason why. And I say often overlooked because when I talk to people about sort of collaboration and sort of, talk about like, why it isn't necessarily happening on its own, collaborative relations, why they aren't happening on their own and things like that, like often the immediate response is something like, well, there's not a lot of time, it takes a lot of money and things like that. And not to say that that's not important, that those things are totally important. But I think it's interesting the way in which when I, press people, to kind of think about other kinds of factors, there are these other things that I think people don't always maybe sort of voice that can really kind of stop them dead in their tracks. And I think it's super interesting because there are many moments in our daily life, right, where we interact with strangers and we don't give it a second thought. I mean, like, when I go and order lunch at a restaurant that I've never been to, I don't even, I don't typically like sort of, like stop from doing so because I'm not really certain what to say. No, I mean, I kind of know what's appropriate or inappropriate to say when the waiter or waitress comes over, and they know what's appropriate or inappropriate to say as well. And you kind of have these expectations for what we're doing. I mean, I'm not going to order my lunch and then be asked to go cook it in the back, right? Like that's just not a thing that's going to happen. We're not going to like go off and like formally collaborate to like chop peppers together. Like that's just not what's going to happen, right? And so it's, but it's interesting, right? How like in those moments, like I am interacting with a stranger and it typically goes fine. But yet here, and I think in so many other places, that is not necessarily the case for a variety of reasons. All right, so I want to sort of present like some data, and I'm just going to let me just say right off the bat that like, I know a lot of folks in the room, at least Hannah has told me a lot of folks in the room, and also from reading the chat box before, are policymakers, state level, municipal level, and, the examples I'm going to present are not, or at least this example rather, is not going to relate necessarily, it's not necessarily going to directly sort of like speak to like, your context, okay? But there is a broader theoretical point that comes out of them. So all of these are basically like surveys or randomized controlled trials that are testing kind of broad hypotheses. And so I just want to kind of say that up front, because I know that the context is that some of you might look at the context and be like, why am I here? Like, it's lunchtime. He was just talking about food. Why am I here? All right. So but anyway, so I want to make sure just to sort of pull that out. So first of all, I want to show like what is the impact of directly communicating relationality, and also just kind of what can that look like. So this was a study that I did. This is going to be a randomized controlled trial that I did with a 501c3 nonprofit organization that builds awareness of climate solutions in chapters across the U.S. And so what they have is they have group leaders in 456 different chapters across the country, covering most congressional districts. And these are volunteer folks. And really what they're doing is they're basically sort of, creating awareness of climate solutions, and they're also sort of building relationships with their elected representatives locally, as well as on Capitol Hill, as well as in state capitals and things like that. And so in early 2019, one of the challenges that they were facing was sustaining volunteer engagement, because what had been happening basically was that particularly kind of after the Trump administration came in, they pulled out of the Paris Agreement. What this organization was seeing was this like huge influx of people to their meetings. And I'm sure many of you can relate to this, right? That like, you go to these meetings, you're like super fired up and whatnot. And like, the problem is that like, if all you ever do is basically keep going to meetings, you're going to eventually stop going. And so you had these like leaders, these group leaders who are sort of like, look, like, we're getting all these people showing up to these rooms, but like, we need to somehow like give them things to do. We can't have just them coming to meetings. They're going to stop coming, right? And so that was one of the challenges, sort of like, what do we know based on the research on voluntarism and things like that? And there is a whole body of research on like kind of voluntarism and, how do you sort of sustain volunteer engagement and things like that? Like, what does it say that might be helpful for us? Like kinds of what are tips and tricks and things like that we could use, that group leaders could use, okay? So what I did is I worked with this organization to say, all right, let's basically try to build new collaborative relationships between experts on that topic, so the volunteerism and volunteer engagement, stuff like that, and these group leaders who, speaking of like lived experience, bring a wealth of expertise to their chapters. They know their chapters better than anybody else. And so the idea was sort of like, and this is sort of a way of also me kind of like putting a little bit meat on the bones in terms of collaborative relationship. And this is an example of informal collaboration. That essentially, like, what they could do is sort of, if you brought the researcher who knows about like the research and volunteer engagement, but that was conducted at a different time in a different place, et cetera. And then you have the group leader who has all this expertise on the local place, the history of it, what the specific challenges are, and things like that. That if they could have a back and forth, they could sort of take the research-based insights and sort of figure out what would be feasible and what might work well in their local place. And that's kind of the idea. So with that in mind, what we varied, and this is the randomized controlled trial part of it, we varied the outreach. Because what we were also concerned about, and the we in this case is me and then the head of this organization. And so not a group leader, but basically the person who sort of like oversees all the group leaders. And what we did is we varied the outreach because, as she said to me in advance, she's like, look, like, I don't know that these group leaders are going to want to interact with a researcher. And remember, like, they're starting off as strangers. Also, I mean, this is voluntary. Nobody has to no group leader has to interact with the researcher or vice versa. It's all voluntary. And so, they might be uncertain about things. And so that's what we did. What we did is we varied the outreach, try to basically overcome two forms of uncertainty about relationality that we thought that the group leaders might have. So let me just show you what this looked like. And by the way, I'm like super excited to share this with you because in part what it's doing is sort of like making explicit things that are often, I think, implicit or left unsaid. And so like often the reaction, of course, you don't have to have this reaction, but often the reaction when I present these findings are people like, oh, it's like, I never really thought about, studying something like that, or like even necessarily being as explicit about this as you were. So, all right. So the group leaders were randomly assigned to one of four groups. And what we did is we varied the email outreach. And so there was a baseline group that got just like basically we're offering you this opportunity. I'll show you what that looked like in a second. I'll put it on the next screen, what the baseline message was. Then we added a little bit of information about what information might be shared to the group, if you interacted with the researcher. And then we had two treatments that aimed to explicitly overcome uncertainty about relationality. One was emphasizing that the researcher understood that the group leader was busy and was going to basically sort of like efficiently share what they knew. And the idea again being that like the group leader might be uncertain about like interacting with the researcher who's just going to go on and on and on about like whatever. And then the second one was basically that the group leader might be uncertain about whether the researcher would actually value their expertise. And so trying to overcome that. And so, and then the outcome was a behavioral outcome. Did they want to informally collaborate? And when I say informally collaborate, I mean, did they want to have a back and forth interaction? Did the group leader want to have a back and forth interaction with the researcher about this challenge related to volunteer engagement? Okay. I'm not going to go through this in detail. This was the baseline message. And all it was basically just saying simply, like, here's this we're offering you this opportunity to connect with a researcher. And it was a partnership with my organization, Research for Impact. That's why that's in bold. But anyway, we know you want to strengthen your volunteer base. There's this organization that builds these connections. Are you interested in being connected? That's like kind of all this was. The treatment groups basically had an extra paragraph that was added in the middle. So right where that red arrow is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm really just going to show you sort of like what that looked like. And so the signaling that you will efficiently share what you know, it looked like this. We said previous participants reported that so this interaction was an extremely efficient experience. The researchers acknowledge that folks are busy and don't have time to keep up on all the latest research that they might wish to. So the name of the game is efficiency. They provide a concentrated dose of news you can use. And that was just in the middle, explicitly stated. The other one, so that was one relationality treatment. The other relationality treatment was signaling that you value others' information. And so here we added this paragraph. Previous participants reported that it was an extremely pleasant and affirming experience. They said that the researchers they spoke with were kind, respectful, genuinely interested in their work, and very clearly want to learn about their organizations. And that's all. So what we're doing is we're just testing when we add either of these paragraphs to the outreach, does that increase people's willingness to interact, or willingness to interact? And, you know, again, what I want to sort of emphasize with this is that, like, what's going on here is, like, nothing here is sort of like rocket science per se, but we are being explicit about sort of what happens when you say this, because otherwise it's left unsaid. So here are the findings. So in the baseline group, we had 6.2% of people, of group leaders who wanted to connect. When we said that we would the researchers would efficiently share what they knew, it shot up to 17.3%. And I want to sort of emphasize, by the way, that we only sent one email. Like, so this is like 17.3% of people responding to one, you know, in that group responding to one email. When we said value others' information, it also shot up, not quite as much, but also shot up to 13.9%. And when we just shared more details about what, you know, what the conversation would look like, what would you be talking about, that was basically the same. I mean, it went down a little bit, but it was basically the same. And so I think what this underscores, so I mean, I want to sort of, you know, share this with you because I think it's interesting to sort of see, like, how can you sort of be explicit about, you know, about, like, you know, how you're going to relate to others. That's really all this is. And it really had a pretty big effect. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say about this for now. I'll also say I'm more than happy to talk about, like, what happened after, like, what was the consequence of the informal collaboration if folks are interested. But for right now, I'm just sort of interested in kind of like looking at it as a, you know, just the initiation. So the other thing, so that is arguably something that, like, anybody can do themselves in the sense that, like, you know, it's sort of a self-service strategy. Like, you know, we can, like, go to potential collaborators and we can say those kinds of things explicitly, potentially, right? The other thing, though, is I know that, like, from talking to Hannah in advance, that, like, a lot of folks in the room, you know, you are organization leaders, or you might basically be a third party where you look out in the world and you say, you know what, honestly, like, I think there's other people who might value collaboration, other kinds of collaborative relationships that might be valuable. And so another thing that to think about is, like, that, you know, one can assess rather unmet desire through just, like, asking people. So basically taking a version of those 5 questions from earlier and just asking people. So what I want to do is just present a couple of examples where I've done that. And this is sort of, it's kind of fun to present these to all of you because these are actually surveys of local policymakers, and then this one's local and the other one's gonna be local and state. And so what I was interested in with these surveys, this one is just assessing an unmet desire for more evidence-informed policymaking process. And what I mean by that was basically asking a national sample of local policymakers, you know, to what extent do you interact with researchers from colleges and universities in your local region? And to what extent would you like to be, basically? And for what purpose? And so, so this is unmet desire for more evidence-informed policymaking process, 541 local policymakers all across the United States in spring of 2021. And so here's just a kind of overview of some of the findings. So what we found was that, like, when we asked, like, whether local policymakers interact with local researchers to tackle policy challenges, what we found was that, like, by and large, like, you know, they didn't. And so that's the tall green, dark green bar all the way on the left is basically saying that, like, they, you know, that close to 80% rarely had not had any collaborative relationships with local researchers over the past year. But yet, when we asked if you wanted, like, basically, like, more or less or the same, what we found was basically that a majority wanted more frequent collaboration. That's the light green bar all the way over on the right. So 57% said that they wanted more than what they have right now. Here we ask the question a little bit differently, which is basically, you know, have you gotten outreach by local researchers to collaborate on policy challenges you're facing in your work? And what we found is that almost 80% said that no, they had not. That's the dark green, the tall dark green bar. But then almost 80% said actually, yes, they would totally welcome unprompted outreach by a local researcher to talk about policy challenges they are facing. And when we asked about the kinds of policy challenges, what we found was basically like an absolute sort of potpourri of all of the kinds of, like, you know, things that local policymakers deal with on a daily basis. And so people would say, like, you know, things like environmental issues, land use issues, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, you know, issues related to education, other public health issues, you name it. It was all over the policing, like all over the board. And these local policymakers, I should say, by the way, were a combination of county and municipal. We also, though, asked about the hesitations, because also I'm interested in sort of, kind of surfacing those relational barriers. And so we gave people a list of 8 of them. And so you can see them listed over on the left-hand side. And what we found was that, like, basically almost 20% of people said, like, yes to 5 out of the 8. And so, there was one hesitation about interacting with local researchers, that they may push a political agenda. That was a big one. But then also they may not have practical information was another, like, fairly frequent one. Interestingly enough, the concern about whether they might have practical information, so that's the 34.1, was substantially larger than, like, they might not have domain-specific expertise, which is the 18.6. And I think it's interesting how there's a distinction there. Also, they may not value my knowledge and experience as a policymaker is about 18%. And so I think it's, these are, I think, like, it's interesting and it's important to sort of surface, this kind of stuff. And especially, I mean, to get almost 20%, expressing like a number of these hesitancies, I think is really quite noteworthy. Let me just present one other survey quickly, which is this is unmet desire not for a more evidence-informed policymaking process, but a more ethics-informed policymaking process. And so here what we assessed was basically how much do you interact with bioethicists? And so, to tackle health challenges. And so this was 3 types of policymakers who make tough decisions related to the health of their community. These were the people who were being surveyed. And so we have local government elected policymakers, local government managers, and state and local government family support civil servants, people who do anything related to sort of family support. And so I'm guessing that, like, this probably encompasses a number of folks in the room, collectively, these 3 groups. And this was a little bit more recent. This was actually almost exactly a year ago. And what we found, and I'll just present a couple of these, just to, for now, but I'm happy to say more during Q&A, is that, like, across the 3 groups, like, almost no one had interacted with a bioethicist at least once over the past year. And I should say that what we did in the beginning of this survey, recognizing that the term bioethicist, not necessarily a household term, there was a little description of sort of like, what is a bioethicist? And so, but almost no one really had said that they'd interact with them over the past year. But yet, when we then asked, like, would you like to be interacting with them more than you have been? We found that, like, actually, like, substantial percentages said yes. So basically between 40 and 50% across the 3 different samples. And so again, sort of, these are really just meant as, like, illustrative examples of asking these kinds of questions in policy contexts, especially kind of in sort of subnational policy contexts. Okay. So let me just sort of maybe just talk for like another like 5 to 10 minutes and just say, kind of like, what are the sort of next steps? So like my hope in our time today is that I'm presenting like a little bit of like interesting stuff, but also actionable stuff that, you can then like take away from this session and, you can sort of implement to maybe change your own thinking about your work, as well as sort of change like the kinds of conversations you're having with colleagues. Either you're already having them or maybe want to be having them. And so I think, like, first of all, in terms of next steps, one is to looks like somebody is off mute. So one of them is like, that you can take the 5 questions from earlier and use that as a starting point for deciding what kinds of new collaborative relationships you want, and then how to connect people with diverse forms of expertise and new. So again, that's in part like what might be valuable to you, what kinds of collaborative relationships might be valuable to you, but then also sort of like, if you maybe could be a matchmaker or something like that. And I sort of especially want to call out this possibility of organization leaders as matchmakers, because I think that's, and really to sort of say, that just to also, in the interest of sort of providing even a little bit more data, I'll just show you sort of what happens when Research for Impact started being more of an active matchmaker. So I presented, an hour ago, I presented Research for Impact 1.0, which was the online platform. That didn't work. And so what we did is we eventually, once people started like revealing all of these like relational barriers, we were like, all right, like, what do we do? And so we said, all right, like, I was like, let me start basically offering more hands-on matchmaking, where I'm basically going to go out to people and I'm going to say, look, like, I'm going to prompt them, like basically acting like an organization leader. I'm going to ask them, like, are there challenges you're facing in your work where you think that interacting with somebody else might be helpful? And I varied the prompt depending on who I was talking to. But it was very much like similar to what was asked in the surveys I just presented, similar to the kinds of questions, those 5 questions at the beginning of this talk. And I just I prompted people, and it turned out that when I did that, people actually responded. And then from there, I would actually make matches. And so I'll just present some of the data because I think it's interesting just to see, kind of like when people were given this opportunity, what happened. And so this is just from the early matchmaking. So 2018, which when we started doing this, and then to 2021. And, what we found was basically that, like, and this was both from researchers requesting matchmaking and practitioners requesting matchmaking. Didn't focus too much on policymakers at the time. But what we found was that, like, we had 128 requests for informal collaboration, which could take a number of different forms. A lot of times it might be either to discuss a large research literature, maybe to make an immediate evidence-based decision, maybe to gain ideas about how to measure impact. So it could really take a number of different forms. But the tie that binds was it was really all about sort of knowledge sharing. And then in some cases, people were looking for more formal collaboration. And in our case, and I get that this might look different for folks in the room, but maybe not. But like it was to work on a new research project where, again, there might be sort of shared ownership, decision-making authority, and accountability between the researcher and the practitioner. So just I'm just sort of I present that more of just I get that it's a little bit outside of the government context per se, but just to kind of give you a sense of what can happen. And I actually have other data on sort of like what even the impact of all of this is. If folks are interested, I'm happy to share that. It's in the extra slides. But just back to this. So next step. So one thing to do is to use the 5 questions. Organization leaders can prompt people with those questions and act as matchmakers. And I think one thing that's really interesting about like acting as a matchmaker that I just want to kind of mention is that, you're bringing together people with diverse forms of expertise and who might be, hesitant in a variety of ways to interact with each other. After all, that's the whole purpose of having a third-party matchmaker in a way. And so one thing that I think is really helpful, there's this technique called role assignment, where when you're bringing people together with diverse forms of expertise, and you think that like political divides might get in the way, you think status-based stereotypes might get in the way of them really having a productive exchange, one thing to do is to actually sort of very explicitly, when connecting people, like identify their task-relevant expertise to each other, make it common knowledge, and be super explicit about it. And what's helpful about that is it not only sort of demonstrates that you as the matchmaker, like why you think they should be interacting, but it also helps to sort of act as conversation starters. Because when you tell somebody, oh, this person is leads this community organization that has been seeing increasing flooding, it naturally lends itself to questions like, oh, how much flooding are you seeing? How often is it happening? How are people responding? It naturally sort of starts the conversation. And I often sort of talk about sort of, kind of trying to grease the wheels of conversation. And then, so, you'll notice that the large majority of what I've talked about is really about initiation. And the reason why I've talked about it is because that was the core challenge that the Research for Impact profile builders back in 2017, that's what they expressed to me. And, there's so much out there about how do you actually collaborate once you're together, right? How do you interact with people once you're together? How do you basically embark on a new project together once you're together? And so I want to just sort of very explicitly call out the fact that I'm trying to focus on this initiation in part because I was seeing that as a huge barrier. And in fact, that I think the specifics about sort of what you do next, if it's informal collaboration, then we can talk about sort of active listening and, and how to sort of follow up and things like that. If it's more formal collaboration, we can talk about sort of, what do you need? What kinds of conversations do you have to have up front? What do you need to put in writing? What does a memorandum of understanding have to look like? Where is the funding going to come from? How can you ensure, this was a point that that was mentioned earlier, how can you ensure that you have buy-in from an organization, not just an individual? And we can talk about all that stuff, but I want to just sort of note, right, that each of those things, and I know that Innovate US sort of hosts seminars on this as well, Each of those things is very specific to particular types of formal collaboration that are going to vary tremendously across people and organizations and stuff. But I wanted to sort of, really kind of call out the fact that I'm very sort of consciously starting on this kind of like, how do you get started? How do you connect people with diverse forms of expertise? Because it often doesn't happen on its own. Okay. Hannah said I could do this. Which is to say that, like, so I do have this new book, and a lot of the kinds of things I've talked about, including sort of like what to do once you're interacting with people, really does come from this book. And so I am just going to sort of make a plug for this. And even if you sort of like don't care about the book at all, I'll at least sort of say I'm happy to take compliments on the cover. I'm happy to take compliments on the title. My husband came up with the title, and the press kept it. Which I was actually quite floored with. And so anyway, if you have any compliments on that, I'm happy to take that. But I did just want to sort of just point out that like this stuff is in here, and our time together is something that is similar to the kinds of workshops I lead with a wide variety of people who are trying to improve communities that they care about. And that's really the kind of expertise becoming useful in civic life that the subtitle is speaking to. And so with that, I'll put this up one more time in case you forgot, who on earth is this guy with the pattern shirt? And just to say, the one thing I'm adding, and in the interest of overcoming uncertainty about relationality, which is I'm adding my email address at the bottom and saying, I really do welcome folks to email me. And I'm happy to have like follow-up conversations because, I think a lot of this stuff, is is again, hopefully interesting, hopefully actionable, but also is, I know that everybody's like challenges and context is different, right? And so, even putting some of the, in the interest of collaborative relationships, the spirit of collaborative relationships, even putting a lot of this stuff into context, thinking about sort of like, how do you measure uncertainty about relationality? How do you think about why the desire is unmet in certain contexts? When should you ask these questions? Who should you ask these questions of? All that kind of stuff. What is role assignment again? Like all this kind of stuff is going to be specific to your context. And I want to say that I'm more than happy to have follow-up conversations with you and or folks on your team or, whatever else, and or, I do a lot of in-person stuff too. And so anyway, thank you so much. And so we have 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I look forward to it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And yeah, so let's do it. What do you got?
Thank you so much, Adam. Let me just take us off recording as promised.